All right, and welcome back to another episode of Phrasing FM, a podcast where I talk about languages and my experience building an app to learn them. Today, I want to talk about something that is experienced by everybody learning a language, but it is not often talked about, and it doesn't really have a name. So, in order to talk about it, I'm also going to give it a name. And that name is language maturation. So today we're going to talk about what is language maturation. What are some of the things that language maturation covers? What is some of the science that actually exists for this concept? And then lastly, why should you care about language maturation? How is this going to help you? Why is this a term that I think should exist in the language zeitgeist? And how will this help you in your language learning? So to start, what is language maturation? When I say that, what do I mean? Because this is a term that I've just come up with. And language maturation is this idea that as you are exposed to a language, you will, over time, internalize the concepts that you're exposed to. Not through dedicated study, not through dedicated immersion, not through input, but just through time. If you see something and you wait some time and you come back to it, it's just going to make more sense. It's had time to mature in your brain. It's had time to assimilate, to integrate. And I really like this term maturation because maturing something is not really a process that you can rush. It's not something that you can do faster. There's no amount of cramming or learning or acquisition that you can do that will help the language mature faster in your head. It is just this automatic process that happens in the background. It's like a clock ticking by. It's going to progress at its own speed, regardless of how much work you do, because there is a component of this to language learning. And that can be that can be taken two ways. That can be a huge relief because you don't always have to be working, and not all of your progress is going to be tied to what you put in. There is some background processing your brain is going to do, so you're always going to be making progress, even when you might not have the time. That's the good side of things. The stressful side of things is no matter how much work you put in, no matter how much you struggle, no matter how much hours you grind away, there's some things that you're just not going to be able to force your brain to understand. They will just take some time. And the best example I can think of this is when I was learning Dutch. So in Dutch, when you use the past tense or one of the past tenses, the verb ends up going to the end of the sentence. So instead of saying, I have gone to the store, you would say, I have to the store gone. And instead of saying, I have eaten today, you would say, I have today eaten, which seems a little bit weird. And then it gets a whole lot weirder when it's a much longer sentence, like, I have to the market down the street today to buy some apples gone. It just seems so weird in English. And when I was learning Dutch, this was just the strangest way of communicating information. I understood it perfectly fine. It made sense perfectly fine. But it was just a struggle for me to process information in this way, to be waiting until the end of the sentence for the verb to come around, to know why should I care about all of this other information that you're telling me if you haven't told me what I'm going to do with it yet. And I studied and I studied and I exposed myself and comprehensible input and flashcards and grammar rules and everything under the sun. And I just could not force my brain to understand this on a native level. And then life happened. Other circumstances came up. Things were more important than language learning. And I didn't really study Dutch for a while. Now, I was living in the Netherlands, so I was still exposed to the language here and there. But when living in Amsterdam, you are exposed to a lot less Dutch than you might think. And after a couple months of not exposing, not immersing, not trying to improve my Dutch, I realized that this moving the verb to the end, strangely, did not feel strange anymore. I didn't do anything to internalize this, but just waiting, just giving it time for my brain to form the connections that need to happen, waiting for this language, this piece of information to mature in my head was the only thing that worked for me to wrap my head around it. And, it's not just me who's benefited from this. I've seen several prominent YouTube figures always talk about this, where sometimes their best progress is made when they step back from a language, when they take a break, when they do something else. And it's not just language learners. This is something that is a common phenomenon across multiple different fields. And so I want to talk about some of the science now that is related to this idea of language maturation and why I think there needs to be another term. So the first thing that comes up is this idea of post-practice improvement. And this is much more applicable to motor skills, anything that's, physical, sports, playing music, or even things like flashcards as well. It could be applied to, but these much more short-term, immediate practices where when you are practicing, it might feel like you're getting worse. Your performance is dropping off a cliff throughout your practice session. It doesn't feel like you're making improvement. You're not getting any better. But then you take some time off and you come back the next practice session, and all of a sudden it's easy. You can play the entire song. You can perform your sport much better. You can do whatever it is you were practicing. Even though it didn't feel like you were getting better before, the time that you took off allowed your brain to form all these new connections and form all of these new motor control associations. And so this idea of post-practice improvement is a really good one. This is well studied, but it feels very short term. It feels very related to the physical, the motor neurons. It's also applicable when talking about like spaced repetition and your recall and your memory, and also about pronunciation. Like this is directly applicable to when you're trying to learn new sounds, and you can try to say them, you can try to say them, you can try to repeat them, and you can try to say your sentences out loud, and you're struggling and you're tripping up over your words. And then the next time you come back to say that sentence, you can say the entire sentence and you don't stumble and you get all of the sounds correct. So this is already something that is directly observable in linguistics, and it only describes a portion of language maturation. So the next principle I want to talk about is memory consolidation. So this is a principle in the field of memory science where if you take a break, your brain will start to consolidate memories. And this is incredibly apparent when doing spaced repetition. So when using phrasing, it uses a spaced repetition algorithm. And if you get a word wrong, it enters the auxiliary review track. So it will show you the word again until you get it right. So to make sure that you remember this word. And I will sometimes get a word wrong so many times in a single day. Once it enters the auxiliary track, I might get it wrong 5, 10, 15 times in a day, and it feels completely hopeless. This word keeps coming up. I know I've seen it 10 times a day. I absolutely cannot access this information, and I just keep getting it wrong. And then I'll take a couple hours off, or even better, I will sleep. Maybe I'll do my reviews in the evening, and I'll sleep for the evening, and I'll wake up in the morning, and I'll do my reviews. And I will get 50% of my auxiliaries correct. Even the ones that I was struggling that I never there was never even a chance I was going to remember them in my practice session. I didn't get them right a couple times. It was just complete zero recall. I go to bed, I wake up, and all of a sudden I know this word like it's the back of my hand. And this is the idea of memory consolidation. So when you take time off from doing something, especially when you sleep, that gives your brain time to save and store facts and consolidate them so they are more easily retrieved. And so, again, this is an existing principle. Again, this is incredibly applicable to language learning. But again, it doesn't cover everything covered by this idea of language maturation, because this is very particular about your memory and recalling specific facts. It's much more applicable to things like grammar, but it's not really applicable to these whole things like sentence structure or parsing information in general in another language. So it's an aspect of language maturation, but it's not the full picture. And one that is more of a full picture, and the third and last principle that I want to talk about, is the incubation effect. And this is something that exists in psychology. It's a phenomenon that's been documented very well, where you might be working on a problem, you might be struggling with something, and you're stressing, you're trying to get the answer to it, and you just cannot make any progress, or you've completely hit a wall. And so you put it aside for a little bit and you go do something else. And either the answer just comes to you, or the next time you sit down to work on it, it just makes sense. And this is so poignant, especially as a programmer, because every single programmer knows the feeling of you're trying to work on a problem, you're working on it all day, you cannot get a solution to it whatsoever, and so you just call it quits for the day. You go home, you do your thing, you wake up the next day, you sit down to work, and it's solved within 5 minutes. The solution was just staring you in the face the entire time. And no matter how hard you worked the day before, no matter how much you struggled, there was no chance you were going to get to this solution. But you take a moment, you step away, you come back, and boom, all of a sudden problem is solved. You found the solution. This was easy. How are you even struggling with this to begin with? This is an example of the incubation effect in action. And it's this idea that, once we step away from something, our brain continues to work on this in the background and continue to try to find a solution to this problem. And in fact, trying to find the solution now can actually be detrimental. So we put so much stress and effort trying to find the solution in the moment, when really what we need to do is just do something else, relax, and let our brains subconsciously work away at this problem. And so this one is a much more kind of larger, more ambiguous principle. It's much closer to language maturation. But the reason I don't like this is twofold. One, I don't like the word incubation. I just think it's weird to incubate your language, that your language was incubated. I just don't like the word. But also, this is much more focused on like creativity and problem solving. So again, it has this final, something in this case needs to be solved. And with language, it's not really so much that something needs to be solved, and more that something just needs to be integrated. It needs to be assimilated into the way that you can process information. Some things do need to be solved. Some things do need to be remembered, but other things just need to be integrated and understood. And so those are the three principles that exist that describe aspects of language maturation. The idea that you're exposing yourself to a language over time has its own independent track of progress, separate from the input you put in, the studying you do, the immersion you do, etc. And so lastly, I want to talk about why should you care about language maturation, and how can you use this to make better progress in your languages? How can you use this to your advantage? For me, I'm very interested in this idea of language maturation for two main reasons. One, you'll often see people who want to learn a language quickly. They want to learn a language fast. You'll see a lot of advertisements for courses, applications, programs to learn a language fast. And it's meant to be impressive if you can learn a language in less time. However, I think there is, and it's definitely impressive to learn a language quickly. There's no doubt about it. But there's something missing from that. And if you were to learn a language incredibly quickly, which for the record would be like 9 months, I think that would be the fastest. I think I've seen somebody really get fluent in a language. They're still missing something. There's still the language has not had time to mature. They're still not fluent in the sense of, it's not flowing easily. It's not effortless to understand the language. It's not effortless to produce the language. This effortlessness, it doesn't come from an amount of just doing things over and over until it becomes automatic. It's not like people, when they speak a language, they've just practiced their conjugation table so quickly that they can conjugate so immediately that it's just automatic. That's not how it works with language. Language is something much more off the cuff, organic. It needs time to mature in your head. It needs time to integrate for it to just become effortless. And there's no amount of study, there's no amount of immersion, there's no amount of work you can put in to do this faster than your brain is going to do it. Your brain is going to just take time to adapt to an entirely new way of thinking, a new way of communicating, an entirely new vocab set, an entirely new way of, describing time and tenses or whatever it is in the new language. It just takes time for your brain to wrap itself around this. The other reason that I really like the idea of language maturation is because it is exactly why I am learning so many languages. And so let me explain. I am learning over a dozen languages at the moment. However, I'm only learning 2 or 3 or maybe 4 of them seriously at any one time. Learning probably 3 or 4 of the languages always counts for more than half of my reviews in a day, maybe even more than 3/4. But I still spend, maybe 1 or 2 minutes a day, or maybe 1 or 2 minutes every other day in all of these other languages. And so why am I doing that? Why am I wasting my study time exposing myself to all of this information that might just confuse me, uh, just to not even really make progress in the language? I'm not, with such little amount of study time, it's not like I'm going to learn a language by seeing it 1 or 2 minutes a day. That would be crazy. And the reason is, besides testing phrasing and making sure that it works in every major language family, which is, the reason why I decided to do this, the primary driver. The other reason is because exposing myself to all of these languages, even if it's just for a minute or two a day, gives me time to let this information mature. So the sentence structure, the general word structure, how to tell whether something is a verb or an adjective, what are these new cases that exist in these new languages, the expressions, the idioms, the way that people construct sentences, all of the phonetics of a language, especially, all of these different things are things that I can expose myself to just a little bit every day and give it time to settle in my brain. Give my brain years to process this information. Even if it's just a slow drip of a little bit of information, it will, over time, just become a natural way of communicating. It won't be something that I'll have to think about. And then when I go to really focus on that language, it's going to feel a lot more natural. It will feel like I can hit the ground running. And this was especially the case. This just proved to be true. Recently, I decided to focus more on Greek. I might be going to Greece soon, and so I figured, let's go ham on Greek. And Greek is a language that I have been just dabbling in the slightest for months now, maybe almost a year. And I have not made really any progress in Greek. It's not like I can speak Greek to any degree. I didn't expect to be making progress in Greek, but Greek is a language isolate, so I hadn't, quite an awesome language at that. And so I had it in my rotation to make sure that phrasing worked for Greek. And so I learned the alphabet just through exposure. I can read and write it now quite comfortably. I started to learn some of the conjugations. I know that O is the ending for first person singular. I know that the S is the ending for the second person. Ume is or like an ME at the end is the plural form, the first person plural. All of these general notions about the language, I've just kind of picked up from being exposed to it. Some of the way that the sentences are constructed, the use of this particle na, some future tense stuff, a couple main verbs that you see all around. And so when I just went to go turn up my progress in Greek, I just raised its level, and all of a sudden I was making progress, and I'm remembering words, and I'm starting to put together sentences. And it's not all of these crazy new sounds and crazy new words and sentence structures or anything like that. It's just this puzzle that now makes, the shape makes more sense. But now I can really start to fill in that puzzle. I can really start to fill in the colors of the language. And I credit this to the fact that I exposed myself to the language, even just a little bit, and I gave it time to mature in my head. I gave it time to sit. Because if you learn a language to any degree, even if it's a very small amount, even if it's a large amount, you will continue to learn and make progress in that language even when you stop studying. Obviously, not indefinitely. You can't just study one day and then wait 10 years and you'll be fluent. It does take, there is some association to the input you put in. But your brain will continue to process, to continue to integrate, to continue to mature the information that you learned. And so I think this becomes a really useful concept in linguistics because you can talk about how much you've learned, but you can also talk about how much has that information matured. And so you can have learned very little, but have all of that information matured really well. That's what I'm trying to do in all of these languages where I'm exposing little bits of a language at a time. Conversely, you can have learned a lot and had that information be not matured yet. It could be very immature information. So yes, you've learned a lot, but you still need to wait time. You still need to wait for that information to mature. And if you have been putting in just hours and hours and grinding and trying to make progress in a language, and you are making progress in the language, but it just feels like things are not clicking, this is probably what's going on. You probably just need to let the language mature. You just need to give it time for your brain to assimilate to these patterns. And to be honest, you might also just need to take a break from the language. And I don't mean completely eschew it and don't do anything, but sometimes the more we try, the more we stress, the more we struggle to wrap our heads around it, the harder it seems to be for our brains to mature the language, to save this information. Maybe you just need to take a look at something else. Maybe you need to just enjoy content in the language. Maybe even just taking a break from the language entirely, studying another language entirely, and coming back to this first language will give your brain the freedom and the mental space to mature this language. And so I think language maturation is a concept that we should introduce into our lexicon. I think this is something that is very important to language learning. It's something that we all experience, and it's something that definitely needs a name. It's definitely backed up by the research. There's a bunch of different research. There's a bunch of different principles that are related, but not all encompassing enough. And it's also something that if we can understand and talk about and identify, I think we can use it to help us make more progress in our languages. So that's the episode for today. If you like this episode, consider liking, subscribing, sharing with your friends. If any of this sounded interesting to you, if you're learning multiple languages, if you like spaced repetition, or if you've tried spaced repetition and found it wasn't for you in the past and really wished you could get the benefits of spaced repetition, consider checking out phrasing.app. It's a language learning app that I built myself over the last 3 years to learn and maintain all my languages, all in the same interface. It's one item I have to do every day on my to-do list. I just do my languages whenever I have time, and it's all set up to be as optimal and efficient and atomic as possible. So like I said, thanks for listening. Catch you in the next one. Ciao.